I've been wanting to do a teaching series on the doctrines of grace, and this venue actually offers a really good opportunity to do that because it's not something I would normally do in the church setting. It's said that a pastor has two sermons. My two are the sovereignty of God and the grace of God. In the next series that we're going to do on the doctrines of grace, we'll be having the opportunity to talk about those more thoroughly. But I think really before we get to that, it's more important in this first installment to talk about the elephant in the living room, and that's the COVID-19 crisis that we're all going through. I think it's fair to say that the world has never been without some threat. There's always been epidemics and pandemics. There's always been illness and disease. It's always been part of our human existence, that tragedies and catastrophes, things that happen. This is the kind of thing that the world's gone through since time began, and even in recent memory, the 1918 Spanish flu that infected 500 million people and killed 50 million. That's not that long ago when you think about it in terms of human history. And even in our lifetimes, we've seen a lot of pandemics come through. We've seen the pandemic of the H1N1 virus that reappeared in 2009. We've seen the SARS in 2003 and MERS. We've seen the Asian flu, the bird flu, HIV, Ebola, and of course we can still look back at the year 2000 when everyone told us that our computers were going to crash on New Year's and that we'd be driven back into the dark ages. And all those things caused us to feel worry, and that's what we're going through right now as a church and as a people, as a community and as a country. And we're faced with worry. We don't like to worry. We like to be in control. We don't like to feel that things are outside of our control, but often it just seems like we have nothing else to do but worry. More than a year ago, I gave a sermon back in Matthew chapter 5, or Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus is talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus says this. He says, "Therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or they reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the lilies of the field grow. They don't labor or spin, and yet I tell you that even Solomon in all his splendor was not dressed like one of these. If this is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and thrown into the furnace tomorrow, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So I say, don't worry." Back in the early 1980s, when I was in graduate school living in Denver, and there was quite a fear of a Russian ICBM attack, and I remember that Federico Pena, who was the mayor of Denver at the time, came up with this brilliant evacuation plan that he then published in the Rocky Mountain News. And his evacuation plan was meant to reduce people's fear, to reduce worry. And so he had this really great idea of what we would do living in this large metropolitan area in the event of an ICBM attack. And his plan was that as soon as they detected the launch, a warning would be given, and everyone was to go home and pack a lunch, load their car with camping equipment, and then drive in an orderly manner to a gas station where they're going to fill up their car, and then proceed along the evacuation routes, which were printed up there in the newspaper. And then they were to drive outside the city, where once they got outside the city, they would find host families in outlying communities that would put them up. Now again, the whole idea was to reduce anxiety and fear and worry, but it was completely worthless because people are not mindless masses, and everybody realized that that wasn't going to work. The truth is, from the time of detecting an ICBM launch and being able to communicate that it really is a launch, you have about a half an hour between detection and impact. And it would take the authorities a significant amount of time just to decide how they were going to notify the population. And then the population was going to have to get home, pack their picnic lunch, pack their car with camping equipment, go to the grocery store, get whatever else they needed, stop by the gas station, top off their tank, and then proceed in this orderly manner to get out of town, where a million other people were going to be trying to do the same thing, and pretty soon the freeways would become a parking lot. And beyond that, who did they think was actually going to host them once they got out of town? Who was going to be willing to let all these Denverites put up in their house, that what would happen was that it was largely just a big waste of time, that between the time they got the announcement and before they even got home, the whole city would have been annihilated by a nuclear bomb. Worry is just that way too. It's something to do when you don't know what else to do, but largely it's a complete waste of time. It's useless, it's futile, it's foolish, it's unproductive. But for a Christian, Jesus says something else too. He says it's not just foolish and futile, it's sinful. The reality is, though, there really are a lot of things to worry about. There's real stuff to worry about. There's the very real concern right now of a global pandemic that we'll get sick, that some people will die. There's the real worry that the stock market will crash and could wipe out our retirement accounts. There's real things to worry about, like credit card debt and pollution and environmental disasters and house fires and riots and robberies and terrorism. There's a lot of real things to worry about. And so how can Jesus now tell us, don't worry, don't be anxious? Because honestly, even the examples that he used raises more questions for us. I mean, he tells us first, consider the birds of the air, and so don't worry. But we know birds are stupid, but there's a lot of stuff for them to really worry about. I mean, birds often starve to death. Birds sometimes get eaten by cats. Birds freeze in the wintertime, and ultimately they die. He tells us about the flowers of the field, but at the same time he tells us they have an exceedingly short lifespan, and after they're beautiful for a very short time, then they die. And the only thing that they're left to be good for is that people gather them up to kindle their fires. So how's that helpful in trying to communicate to us why we shouldn't worry? And worry is a part of our society. It's a part of our culture. There's scores of books that have been written on how to cope with worry, and there's seminars that teach us how to face stress and the anxiety that comes. There are arrays of drugs that people literally take by the tons in the Western world of hoping to dull the effects of worry and anxiety, and people go to counseling in droves, and many advertisers prey on people's worry and anxiety. And of course, now we see newscasters which are inspiring fear by giving us the most fear-inspiring possibilities that might happen. And then they end it by saying, oh yeah, but don't panic. There's all these things to be afraid of, but don't panic. I think we can conveniently state that the people that Jesus was talking to didn't have the same kind of first world problems that we have, and so they didn't have the same kind of things that we worry about. And that's true on a certain level. I mean, they didn't really worry about not having enough toilet paper or not getting enough sanitizer. They didn't really worry about facing long lines at Costco, but they knew what it was like to suffer. They knew what it was like to be under constant threat of an invading army coming and taking things from them. They knew what it was like to experience crop failure or drought or water shortages. They knew what it was like to face unemployment where there was no government subsidies, no help from the outside, to face the ravages of disease and sickness without any antibiotics or any vaccines or any kind of health care. They knew what it was like to be a slave and have no hope of deliverance. Don't fool yourself to think that they lived some idyllic life where they had nothing to worry about. They had everything to worry about. And yet it's at this setting that Jesus commands kingdom citizens, don't worry. Don't worry about your life. And so really, what does he mean by that? You know, what does he want us to do? And how can we as Christians face the reality that we're in with our eyes wide open, realistically, and still at the same time live without worry and anxiety? You know, by definition, a Christian is someone who says he wants to live his life for eternity and not just for this time only. He wants to live for Christ, who gave himself up for us, who died for us. And as a Christian, we would consider any hardship that we endure, if it brings God glory, that it would be worth the sacrifice. Really, is there anything more pleasing for us as a Christian than know that God is pleased with us, even through the hardship that we have to endure? As Christians, we state that what we believe and what we place our life on and how we live our lives is based on something which is true, whereas the rest of the world, which is not saved, is following a falsehood. But who's going to believe us when what we do and how we live and how we face the crisis is really no different from how everybody else